In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the liberation of France, a 32-year-old woman with auburn hair and a reputation that made Gestapo agents whisper her name in fear stood at the open door of a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber, staring into the black void above occupied France. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake had already lived enough lives for several people. A journalist in pre-war Europe, a courier for the French resistance, an escapee who had fled across the Pyrenees when the net closed around her, and now, finally, an agent of Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Churchill's famous Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. The wind tore at her face as she prepared to jump, her parachute pack heavy on her back, her mind racing through the coordinates of her drop zone near Châteauroux, the recognition signals she would need to give, and the terrible knowledge that hundreds of Germans were already hunting her by name. The Gestapo had placed a 5 million franc bounty on her head, calling her the White Mouse for her ability to evade their traps, and they had tortured her friends to learn her whereabouts. Now she was returning to the very territory where she was most wanted, not to hide, but to fight, armed with a cyanide pill she hoped never to use, a suitcase containing 2 million francs for the resistance, and a determination forged in the fires of loss and betrayal that had consumed her adopted country. The jumpmaster's hand squeezed her shoulder, the signal, and Nancy stepped into nothingness, plummeting through darkness toward a France that had broken her heart and now demanded everything she had left to give. Her story had begun years earlier, in the halcyon days before the world caught fire, when Nancy had arrived in Paris as a bright young journalist from Australia, full of ambition and the restless energy that would define her life. She had witnessed Hitler's rise firsthand, attending the 1933 Nuremberg rallies as a reporter, where the theatrical brutality of Nazism left her shaken but determined to resist. When war came in 1939, she was living in Marseille with her French husband, Henri Fiacre, a wealthy industrialist whose charm and connections had initially shielded them from the worst of the gathering storm. But the fall of France in June 1940 changed everything. Nancy watched in horror as the country she loved collapsed in 6 weeks, its army shattered, its government suing for peace, and the dark shadow of German occupation spreading from Paris to the Mediterranean coast. The armistice left France divided, the occupied north and the supposedly free zone of Vichy France in the south. But for those who wished to resist, there was no zone free enough to escape the reach of collaboration and treachery. Nancy could have remained safe. Her husband's wealth and social standing offered protection, and as a foreign national, she might have claimed neutrality and waited out the war in comfortable obscurity. Instead, she chose the path of danger, driven by a moral clarity that would not permit her to stand aside while others suffered. Her resistance work began modestly, but grew with terrifying speed. Initially, she served as a courier for an escape network called the Pat O'Leary Line, helping Allied airmen who had been shot down over occupied Europe to evade capture and return to Britain. She would meet them in safe houses, provide them with false papers, guide them through checkpoints with a coolness that belied the pounding of her heart, and arrange their passage over the Pyrenees into neutral Spain. The work required constant movement, a network of trusted contacts, and an instinct for danger that Nancy seemed to possess in abundance. She drove hundreds of miles across France, her beauty and apparent frivolity serving as perfect camouflage for her deadly, serious purpose. German soldiers at roadblocks would see only a charming woman in expensive clothes, perhaps flirting or playing the silly socialite, never suspecting that her car carried escaped prisoners of war or that her shopping bags concealed radio parts and coded messages. But the net was tightening. The Gestapo, frustrated by the steady flow of airmen escaping their grasp, began to penetrate the networks, arresting couriers and torturing them for information. Nancy's name appeared on their lists, and by 1942, she had become one of their most wanted targets. The escape that saved her life came in the nick of time. Warned that the Gestapo was closing in, Nancy fled Marseille in November 1942, just days before German troops occupied the whole of France in response to the Allied landings in North Africa. Her flight was a nightmare of close calls and desperate improvisation. She traveled alone, by train and on foot, through territory where a single checkpoint could mean death. The Pyrenees in winter presented an almost insurmountable barrier: snow-covered peaks, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of border patrols. Nancy climbed for 3 days, her feet blistered and bleeding, sleeping in caves and eating what little food she could carry, until she finally crossed into Spain and made her way to Britain. The joy of survival was immediately crushed by devastating news. Henri, her husband, had been arrested by the Gestapo in her absence. They had tortured him mercilessly, trying to extract her whereabouts, but he had refused to betray her, enduring beatings and abuse with a silence that cost him his life. When Nancy learned in London that Henri had been executed by firing squad, something hardened in her forever. The grief was absolute, a wound that would never fully heal, but she transformed it into fuel for the war she was determined to win. She volunteered immediately for the SOE, demanding to be trained and sent back to France to kill Germans and destroy their occupation. The British, initially skeptical of this passionate woman who spoke fluent French but lacked military experience, soon recognized that they had found something rare: a natural warrior with intimate knowledge of the terrain, the language, and the resistance networks that would be crucial to the coming liberation. Her SOE training was brutal and comprehensive, designed to forge civilians into saboteurs and killers. Nancy learned to use firearms with deadly accuracy, to handle explosives and detonators, to kill with her bare hands using techniques that left no room for hesitation or mercy. She practiced parachute jumps, learned Morse code and radio operation, studied the organization of the German army and the methods of the Gestapo. Through it all, she displayed a ferocious competence that impressed even her hardened instructors. By early 1944, with the Allied invasion of Normandy being planned, the SOE needed agents who could coordinate the massive expansion of resistance activity that would support the landings. Nancy was chosen to lead an SOE circuit in the Auvergne region of central France, a mountainous area that would be crucial for harassing German reinforcements trying to reach the coast. Her mission was to parachute into occupied territory, link up with the Maquis, the rural guerrilla fighters of the French resistance, and organize them into an effective military force capable of sabotage, ambush, and intelligence gathering. The risks were enormous. If captured, she would face torture and execution as a spy. If her parachute failed, she would die in the French countryside she had crossed so often in her courier days. If the Germans were waiting at her drop zone, she would be shot before she touched the ground. None of this deterred her. On the night of April 29, 1944, Nancy Wake boarded the Halifax bomber that would carry her back to the war, her mind fixed on the task ahead and the memory of Henry's sacrifice driving her forward into the darkness. Part 2, the landing in the fields near Châteauroux, was rougher than training had prepared her for. The ground rushing up through darkness to slam against her legs and roll her through damp grass and wheat stubble. But Nancy was up in moments, gathering her parachute and burying it quickly before the reception committee emerged from the tree line with the coded signals she had been waiting to hear. They were Maquis fighters, rough men in civilian clothes carrying Sten guns and ancient hunting rifles, their faces hard with the privations of years living in forests and barns, constantly hunted by German patrols and French collaborators. Among them stood Henri Tardivat, the local Maquis leader whose reputation for daring attacks had made him a legend in the region, and whose initial skepticism about receiving a female commander melted away within hours of meeting this indomitable woman who spoke their language, understood their suffering, and showed absolutely no fear. The journey to their base in the mountainous Forêt de Troncaise took 3 days of traveling only at night, hiding in haylofts during daylight hours, eating cold rations, and listening for the sound of German engines or the barking of tracker dogs. Nancy used the time to assess her new comrades, to learn the structure of their organization, and to begin planning the campaign of sabotage that would make this region a nightmare for German logistics. She carried with her the 2 million francs, which would buy weapons, food, and medical supplies. But more importantly, she brought the authority of the Allied High Command and the promise that liberation was coming, that their sacrifices in the shadows would soon be vindicated in the light of victory. The Maquis of the Auvergne were a disparate collection of men who had fled the forced labor draft in France, escaped prisoners of war, Spanish Republicans who had been fighting fascism since 1936, and idealistic young Frenchmen who refused to accept defeat. They lived in makeshift camps deep in the forests, constantly moving to avoid German sweeps, subsisting on what they could forage or steal, and nursing a desperate hunger for weapons that would allow them to strike back effectively. Nancy's arrival transformed their situation. Using her SOE contacts and radio operators, she coordinated supply drops from British aircraft, containers parachuting down in the night filled with Sten submachine guns, Bren light machine guns, explosives, ammunition, medical supplies, and the precious radio sets that would connect them to London. She established a network of arms caches throughout the region, hidden in caves, buried in churchyards, concealed in the cellars of sympathetic farmers. But weapons alone did not make an army, and Nancy understood that these men needed discipline, training, and leadership to become more than just desperate fugitives. She organized them into companies, appointed officers, established codes and procedures for security, and personally led training sessions in ambush tactics, demolition, and close-quarters combat. Her energy seemed inexhaustible. She would march with the men for hours through difficult terrain, demonstrating how to set explosive charges on railway lines, how to derail trains carrying German troops and supplies, how to hit hard and disappear before the enemy could react. The Gestapo and their French collaborators in the milice were not idle while Nancy built her force. They knew that something was happening in the Auvergne, that the scattered bands of Maquis were consolidating under new leadership, that the frequency of sabotage was increasing dramatically. The German High Command, already stretched thin by the demands of the Eastern Front and the looming threat of Allied invasion, could not spare large forces for anti-partisan operations, but they dispatched specialist units and increased the pressure on local populations to inform. Nancy lived with the constant knowledge that any villager might betray them for money or under torture, that her face was known from her courier days, that the 5 million franc bounty still stood. She moved constantly between camps, never sleeping in the same place twice, using a dozen different identities and disguises. Sometimes she would appear as a middle-aged peasant woman in worn clothes and a headscarf, her beauty hidden beneath dirt and a stooped posture. Other times as a sophisticated Parisian visiting relatives in the countryside. Her radio operators, the vital link to London, were especially vulnerable. German direction-finding units prowled the roads in vans equipped to detect transmission signals, and several of Nancy's colleagues were caught in the act of sending, tortured for their codes, and executed. Each loss was a blow, but Nancy refused to let grief slow her down. She recruited and trained new operators, established more sophisticated security procedures, and kept the flow of intelligence and coordination moving despite the risks that by May 1944, the tempo of operations had increased to a fever pitch. The Allied invasion was imminent, though its exact timing remained the most closely guarded secret in the world, and the SOE circuits across France were tasked with preparing the ground for D-Day through maximum disruption of German communications and transportation. Nancy's Maquis launched attacks on railway bridges, cutting the vital lines that connected central France to the Normandy coast. They sabotaged telephone and telegraph lines, forcing the Germans to rely on radio communications that could be intercepted. They attacked German convoys on remote roads, killing soldiers, destroying vehicles, and capturing weapons and documents. The Germans responded with ferocity, launching sweeps through the forests with columns of troops supported by armored cars and sometimes aircraft. These operations were designed to pin the Maquis against natural barriers and destroy them through superior firepower, and they came terrifyingly close to succeeding on several occasions. Nancy developed an instinct for when to stand and fight and when to melt away into the terrain, but she also demonstrated a willingness to take risks that astonished her subordinates. She would personally reconnoiter German positions, crawling through undergrowth to within yards of enemy outposts, counting troops and vehicles, mapping defenses, and then crawling back to plan the attack. She led ambushes from the front, her Sten gun blazing, her voice cutting through the chaos to direct fire and coordinate withdrawal. The human cost of this war in the shadows was relentless. The Germans took reprisals against villages suspected of supporting the Maquis, executing hostages, burning farms, deporting entire populations to forced labor in Germany. Nancy had to balance the military necessity of action against the certainty of civilian suffering, a moral calculus that haunted her sleepless hours. She established systems to warn villages of impending German sweeps, organized the evacuation of families most at risk, and worked to ensure that the Maquis were seen as protectors rather than provocateurs by the local population. Yet she never flinched from the hard decisions. When a collaborator threatened to expose a safe house, when a German officer needed to be assassinated to prevent an operation, when a captured comrade was being tortured and might break, Nancy gave the orders that needed to be given. Her Maquis grew from several hundred men to over 7,000 organized fighters, the largest single resistance force in France, and they controlled significant territory in the Auvergne that the Germans could enter only in strength. This was the situation on June 6, 1944, when the news burst upon them like thunder. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The invasion had begun. The long-awaited liberation was finally underway. Nancy gathered her commanders and told them that their moment had come, that the Germans would now be desperate to move reinforcements to the coast, and that it was their duty to make every road, every railway, every bridge in their region a death trap for the enemy. The response was immediate and devastating. Nancy's forces launched coordinated attacks across the Auvergne, cutting the Clermont-Ferrand to Montluçon Railway in 20 places, destroying bridges, ambushing convoys, and forcing the Germans to divert precious troops from the Normandy front to deal with this uprising in their rear. The Gestapo redoubled their efforts to eliminate the White Mouse, pouring agents and informers into the region. But Nancy was always one step ahead, moving her headquarters, changing her patterns, striking where least expected, and vanishing before retaliation could arrive. The weeks following D-Day were both the most exhilarating and the most dangerous of Nancy's war, as the German army, reeling from the Allied beachhead, but still ferociously powerful, struggled to maintain its grip on France, while Nancy's Maquis turned the Auvergne into a cauldron of resistance that threatened to boil over into open liberation. She established her headquarters in a remote farmhouse near the village of Montluçon, for which she could coordinate operations across the region, while remaining hidden from the increasingly desperate German sweeps. The farmhouse became a hub of activity, radio operators tapping out messages to London, couriers arriving with intelligence from agents in the towns, weapons being distributed to newly recruited fighters who came daily from the villages, inspired by the Allied landings and the visible success of the resistance. Nancy worked 18-hour days, planning attacks, interrogating captured Germans for intelligence, negotiating with local officials who were beginning to shift their allegiance from the collaborationist government to the emerging forces of liberation. She slept in snatches, fully dressed with her weapons within reach, her mind constantly racing through the endless problems of supply, security, and strategy. The physical toll was immense. She had lost weight, her face was drawn and weathered, her hands scarred from handling weapons and explosives. But her energy seemed to feed on itself, driven by the knowledge that every day of delay for German reinforcements meant lives saved on the Normandy beaches and in the Bocage country where the Allied advance had bogged down in brutal fighting. The German response to the Maquis uprising was systematic and merciless. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, ordered that all resistance activity be crushed with maximum severity, and specialist anti-partisan units were dispatched to the troubled regions. These were not ordinary soldiers, but hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had learned their trade suppressing guerrillas in Russia and Yugoslavia, who understood terror as a weapon and used it without compunction. They moved through the countryside in columns of trucks and armored cars, burning farms, executing suspected Maquis and their families, establishing fortified posts in strategic villages to control the population. Against such forces, Nancy's lightly armed guerrillas could not stand in conventional battle, and she developed tactics of harassment and delay, mining roads, sniping at convoys, hitting supply dumps and disappearing before the Germans could concentrate their strength. But there were moments when standing firm was the only option, when a position had to be held or a village protected, and these were the moments that tested her leadership to the absolute limit. She learned to read the terrain with a soldier's eye, identifying the ridges and forests that offered defensive advantages, the narrow valleys that could be turned into killing grounds for ambush, the paths of withdrawal that would save her men when the weight of German firepower became overwhelming. The intelligence war was as crucial as the military one. Nancy cultivated a network of informants throughout the region. Railway workers who could report troop movements, telephone operators who listened to German conversations, farmers who observed the construction of defenses and the positioning of artillery. This information flowed to her headquarters, where she analyzed it with the help of her radio operators and passed the most crucial details to London, where Allied planners used it to track German reinforcements heading for Normandy. The Germans knew that their communications were compromised, but they could not identify the sources of the leaks, and their frustration expressed itself in ever more brutal interrogations of captured suspects. Nancy lived with the knowledge that her informants were being hunted, that every piece of intelligence she received might have been bought with someone's suffering or death. She established strict security protocols, cutouts between sources and headquarters, dead drops for messages, recognition signals that changed weekly. But in a war where neighbors spied on neighbors and torture could break the strongest will, no system was perfect. Several of her best agents disappeared, arrested by the Gestapo, and never heard from again. Their fates unknown until after the war, when the full scale of German atrocities became clear by mid-June. The situation had reached a critical phase. The Allied advance in Normandy had stalled against fierce German resistance, and Field Marshal Rommel was gathering forces for a counterattack that might yet throw the invaders back into the sea. Every German soldier, every tank, every artillery piece that could be diverted from the coastal front to deal with internal security was a contribution to Allied victory, and Nancy intensified her operations accordingly. She planned and executed a series of spectacular attacks. A raid on the Montluçon power station that plunged the city into darkness, an ambush on a German staff car that killed 3 high-ranking officers, the destruction of a munitions train that lit the night sky for miles around. These successes brought risks as well as rewards. The Germans identified the Auvergne as the center of the most dangerous resistance activity in France, and they prepared a major operation to eliminate the threat once and for all. Intelligence reached Nancy through her network that a large-scale sweep was being planned, involving several thousand troops with air support, designed to encircle and destroy her forces in their forest strongholds. She had days, perhaps hours, to prepare her response, to decide whether to disperse her forces and abandon their positions, or to stand and fight against overwhelming odds. The decision she made revealed the essence of her leadership. Nancy understood that dispersion would save lives in the short term, but would cede the initiative to the Germans, allowing them to re-establish control over the region and resume the flow of reinforcements to Normandy. She chose instead to concentrate her forces, to identify the most defensible positions, and to prepare to meet the German attack with everything her Maquis could muster. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions. If her positions were overrun, her army would be shattered and the resistance in central France set back months. But she had studied the terrain, knew the capabilities of her men, and trusted that the Germans, fighting far from their supply lines in hostile territory, would be vulnerable to determined resistance. She established her command post on a wooded ridge overlooking the village of Vichy, ironically near the seat of the collaborationist government that claimed to rule France, and prepared her defenses with the methodical precision of a professional soldier. Machine guns were sighted to cover approaches, mortars registered on likely assembly areas, explosives laid on paths that German infantry would use. She toured the positions personally, speaking to her fighters, many of whom had never experienced major combat, steadying their nerves with her calm confidence and reminding them of what they were fighting for. The night before the German attack was expected, she sat with her senior commanders reviewing plans, her face illuminated by the glow of a shaded lantern, and told them that whatever happened in the coming days, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had held a piece of France free from German control, had proven that the spirit of resistance lived, and had struck blows that would help bring the liberation closer. Then she slept for 2 hours, rose before dawn, and took her position at the forward observation post, binoculars in hand, waiting for the battle to begin. The German attack came with a morning mist, columns of infantry, supported by armored cars and light tanks, moving up the valley roads, their advance preceded by probing patrols and the terrifying scream of artillery shells seeking out Maquis positions. Nancy watched their approach through her binoculars, counting their numbers, identifying their units, waiting for the moment when they were fully committed before unleashing her ambush. The tension was unbearable. Men crouched in their positions, fingers on triggers, listening to the crunch of boots on gravel and the rumble of engines growing louder. When the lead German elements reached the designated point, Nancy gave the signal, and the ridge erupted in fire. Machine guns raked the road, mortars exploded among the packed infantry, and the advance staggered under the shock of the unexpected resistance. For a moment, the Germans wavered, their officers trying to reorganize under fire, but they were veterans of many campaigns and quickly adapted, deploying their own mortars and machine guns to suppress the Maquis fire while their armored vehicles sought flanking positions. The battle settled into a brutal exchange of fire, the Maquis holding their ground despite casualties, the Germans grinding forward yard by yard through the murderous terrain. Nancy moved along the line, directing fire, reinforcing threatened sectors, her presence everywhere at once, her voice cutting through the din to coordinate the defense. She carried her Sten gun and used it when positions were threatened, her accuracy and coolness under fire inspiring her men to hold when every instinct screamed at them to run. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher and the temperature rising, the dead and wounded accumulating on both sides, and still the Germans came on, their discipline and firepower slowly telling against the Maquis defenses. The afternoon of that first day brought a crisis that tested Nancy's leadership to its absolute limit, as the Germans, adapting to the terrain with the professionalism of long experience, managed to turn the Maquis left flank and threatened to roll up the entire position before nightfall, could provide respite and the possibility of withdrawal. She was with the forward platoon when the warning came. German troops had infiltrated through a wooded ravine that her scouts had deemed impassable, emerging behind the main defensive line with light machine guns and grenades, creating panic among the younger fighters who had never experienced being caught between two fires. Nancy reacted with instantaneous decision, gathering a scratch force of 20 men from the reserve and leading them personally in a counterattack down the slope toward the infiltrators, her Sten gun chattering in short, controlled bursts, as she moved from cover to cover with the grace of someone who had long ago accepted death as a companion and thus feared nothing. The fight was brutal and intimate, distances closing to mere yards in the dense undergrowth, the sounds of battle reduced to the sharp crack of individual shots, the grunt of men hit, the desperate shouts of recognition in two languages as enemies stumbled upon each other in the chaos of trees and rocks. Nancy killed at least 3 Germans that afternoon, her aim steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, her mind clear and calculating even as her body moved on instinct trained through months of SOE preparation and the harder education of survival in occupied France. The counterattack succeeded, barely, the German infiltrators driven back with heavy losses or killed where they stood. But the cost to Nancy's force was severe. 11 of her 20 men were dead or wounded, and ammunition was running dangerously low as the supply lines she had established were cut by other German columns moving through the rear areas. She gathered her surviving fighters in a shell-scarred clearing, their faces blackened by powder smoke and streaked with sweat, and told them with absolute honesty that they faced a choice: attempt to break out in small groups under cover of darkness, scattering into the forest to reform another day, or hold their positions through another day of fighting in the hope that German losses would force a withdrawal. The vote was unanimous. These rough men who had started as fugitives and deserters transformed by shared hardship and her example into soldiers who would not abandon their ground while she remained with them. Nancy spent the night reorganizing her defenses, shifting the remaining machine guns to cover the most likely avenues of German attack, sending out patrols to harass the enemy positions and prevent them from resting, and personally carrying ammunition to positions that were running dry. She visited every wounded man, speaking quietly to those who would not see mourning and arranging for the others to be evacuated to a hidden field hospital in a cave system 2 miles to the rear. The work of command never ceased. Radio messages to coordinate with other Maquis units operating in the region, coded signals to London reporting the situation and requesting airdrops of supplies that might or might not arrive, decisions about which positions could be held and which must be abandoned to concentrate her dwindling strength. Dawn of the second day revealed that the Germans had been reinforced during the night. Fresh troops arriving by truck from Mont-Lucan to replace the battered units that had borne the brunt of the first day's fighting, and the morning opened with a heavy artillery bombardment that sought to pulverize the Maquis positions before infantry advanced to finish the job. Nancy had anticipated this, pulling her men back from the most exposed forward positions during the night, and the shells fell largely on empty trenches, but the psychological pressure was immense. The earth shaking, trees splintering, the air itself seeming to burn with the concussion of high explosive. She moved through this inferno with apparent calm, checking that her men were keeping their heads down, counting them as they emerged from the shelters when the barrage lifted, always calculating, always planning 3 moves ahead. When the German infantry came forward, they met the same determined resistance as the day before, but Nancy could feel the strain in her force. The wounded were mounting, ammunition was critically short, and the sheer weight of German numbers was pushing her line back toward the ridge where she had established her final defensive position. By midday, she had contracted her perimeter to a tight circle around the command post, perhaps 200 men still effective against 10 times their number. The situation desperate, but not yet hopeless. That it was then that the German commander made his mistake, or perhaps Nancy's desperate situation forced his hand. He committed his armored vehicles to a direct assault up the main approach to the ridge, seeking to break the Maquis resistance with a display of mechanical power that no lightly armed guerrilla force could withstand. Nancy watched the armored cars and light tanks grinding up the slope, their machine guns and cannon searching for targets, and she made a decision that would be remembered and debated in military histories for decades to come. She had held back her last reserve, a group of 50 men armed with the few anti-tank weapons her supply drops had provided, British PIT launchers and magnetic mines, and she positioned them in a gully that the German vehicles would have to pass to reach her main position. The risk was enormous. If the ambush failed, her reserve would be destroyed and her position overrun. If it succeeded, she would have struck a blow that might break the German attack entirely. She placed herself with the ambush party, personally sighting the PIT launchers, calculating ranges and angles, waiting with the terrible patience of the hunted predator for the moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. The lead German vehicle, a light armored car with a 20mm cannon, rumbled past her position not 20 feet away, close enough that she could see the face of the commander scanning the trees for threats, and she gave the signal. The explosion was deafening in the confined space of the gully, the shaped charge of the PIT striking the vehicle's thin side armor and penetrating to the crew compartment, killing the men inside instantly and blocking the narrow road with the burning wreckage. The following vehicles slammed to a halt, their commanders realizing too late that they had entered a trap, and Nancy's men were upon them with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails, swarming the steel beasts with desperate courage born of the knowledge that there was no retreat possible. She was in the thick of it, firing her pistol at German crewmen trying to escape their disabled vehicles, directing the placement of mines on tank tracks, her voice somehow audible above the roar of engines and the crack of small arms fire. 2 more vehicles were destroyed in as many minutes, the rest frantically reversing down the slope or abandoning the road to escape through the rough terrain where they were vulnerable to infantry attack. The German infantry, seeing their armored support destroyed or fleeing, lost the momentum of their advance and went aground, pinned down by the sudden resurgence of Maquis fire from positions they had thought suppressed. Nancy did not pause to celebrate. She immediately organized a counterattack with every man who could still move, striking the disorganized German infantry before they could recover from the shock of losing their armored support. The fighting that followed was the most intense of her war, perhaps of her life. She led from the front, as she always did, her Sten gun emptying magazine after magazine as she advanced from tree to tree, her example pulling her men forward into the teeth of German fire that should have been overwhelming. They cleared the forward German positions in a frenzy of close combat, bayonets and knives supplementing bullets when the fighting came to arm's length, and Nancy killed with her own hands a German officer who rose from a shell crater with pistol drawn, her knife finding his throat before his weapon could level. The German attack, which had begun with such confidence that morning, was dissolving into chaos, their casualties mounting, their commander unable to coordinate his scattered units in the broken terrain. By late afternoon, Nancy's counterattack had pushed the Germans back nearly half a mile from her original positions, and she could see through her binoculars the signs of withdrawal. Vehicles being loaded with wounded, officers gathering their men into defensive perimeters rather than pressing the attack. She wanted to pursue, to turn retreat into rout. But she forced herself to be prudent, to consolidate her gains and prepare for the possibility that this was merely a pause before renewed assault. Her own casualties had been appalling. Perhaps a third of her force killed or seriously wounded, ammunition nearly exhausted, many of her automatic weapons destroyed or captured by the enemy. But they had defeated a force 10 times their number in conventional military terms, and the news was already spreading through the region, through the resistance networks, reaching London and the Free French authorities, that the White Mouse and her Maquis had won a spectacular victory against the German army. The night that followed was one of exhaustion and grief, mixed with the desperate joy of survival. Nancy walked among her wounded, helping where she could, speaking words of comfort to men who had followed her into the inferno and come out the other side, identifying the dead for burial in the forest earth that would be their memorial until France was free and proper honors could be paid. She wrote reports by candlelight in her command post, her hand shaking with fatigue, detailing the battle for London and requesting the medical supplies and ammunition that would allow her to continue operations. The German withdrawal, when it came the following morning, was complete. They had suffered too heavily, their commander reported, to justify further losses in what was increasingly clearly a secondary theater while the fate of Germany was being decided in Normandy. Nancy watched them go from a distance, the columns of trucks carrying the battered remnants of their force back toward Montlucan, and felt not triumph, but a profound weariness, the accumulated weight of responsibility for so many lives, so many deaths, the knowledge that this victory, however spectacular, was merely one episode in a war that continued. She gathered her surviving commanders and told them that the battle was won but not the war, that the Germans would return in other forms with other forces, and that they must use this respite to rebuild, rearm, and prepare for the next test. Then she slept for 12 hours, the first true rest in days, and woke to the news that Allied forces had broken out of the Normandy beachhead and were advancing across France, that the liberation she had fought for through so many years was finally becoming reality. The weeks following the Battle of the Ridge were a blur of movement and transformation, as the strategic situation shifted with bewildering speed and Nancy's Maquis evolved from hunted guerrillas into an organized military force that could operate in daylight, control territory, and coordinate with the Allied armies advancing from Normandy. She led her men in a series of operations designed to complete the isolation of German forces in central France. Attacks on isolated garrisons that forced their surrender, the cutting of remaining communication lines, the protection of bridges that would be needed for the Allied advance. The liberation of Montlucan itself came in late August, Nancy's forces linking up with regular French troops and American units that had driven eastward with remarkable speed, the German occupation of 4 years collapsing in days as the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Reich and the Vichy regime dissolved into chaos and flight. She entered the city she had fought to free at the head of her column, her uniform patched and stained, her face gaunt but her eyes burning with the intensity that had carried her through the darkest hours, and was greeted by crowds who had heard rumors of the woman warrior of the Auvergne, but hardly knew what to make of this slight figure who looked more like an exhausted refugee than the legendary White Mouse of Gestapo nightmares. The formal ceremonies of liberation meant little to her. The speeches, the flag raisings, the arrests of collaborators that would mark the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. She was already thinking ahead to the final push into Germany, to the possibility of continuing her war until the Nazi regime was utterly destroyed. The SOE recalled her to London in September 1944, her mission in France complete, the circuits she had established now taken over by regular military authorities, preparing for the invasion of Germany itself. The departure was harder than she had anticipated, leaving behind the men she had fought beside, the country she had adopted and bled for, the graves of those who would not see the victory they had earned. She made a final tour of her battlefields, the ridge where she had led the firefight that saved her unit, the forests where her Maquis had hidden and planned, the villages where ordinary people had risked everything to support the resistance. At Henry's grave in Marseille, which she had located through the chaos of liberation, she stood in silence for a long time, remembering the man who had died protecting her, whose sacrifice had fueled her determination through every hardship. She told him that she had kept her promise, that the Germans were defeated, that France would be free, and she wept for the first time since the war began, the tears releasing years of grief and tension that she had kept locked away behind the mask of command. Then she dried her eyes and boarded the aircraft that would carry her back to Britain, back to a world that could never fully understand what she had experienced, what she had done, what she had become. The final months of the war found Nancy in a strange limbo, too valuable to risk in further operations, but too experienced to be wasted on administrative duties. She worked at SOE headquarters, training new agents for operations in the Pacific Theater against Japan, sharing the lessons she had learned about guerrilla warfare, leadership under extreme pressure, and the psychology of resistance. She spoke to senior officers and politicians about the potential of special operations, the importance of supporting resistance movements, the need to prepare for future conflicts that would surely come. But part of her remained in the forests of the Auvergne, in the fire and smoke of that desperate battle, and she knew that she would spend the rest of her life trying to integrate those experiences with the ordinary world of peace. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, she celebrated with her colleagues, drank champagne, and felt a profound emptiness that she could not explain to anyone who had not been there, who had not made the choices she had made and lived with their consequences. The post-war years brought recognition that she had never sought and found uncomfortable. Medals from Britain, France, the United States, Australia, the celebrations of a world eager to honor heroes while avoiding too close an examination of what heroism had required. She returned to Australia, tried civilian life, married again, found that the skills that had made her a brilliant guerrilla commander did not translate easily to the routines of peacetime existence. She ran for Parliament, worked as a journalist again, moved to England, outlived her second husband, and gradually became a living legend, the White Mouse of countless books and documentaries, her story told and retold until it threatened to become mere adventure rather than the complex reality she had lived. She died in 2011, at the age of 98, the last of the SOE's female agents to pass. Her final years spent in a nursing home where she sometimes woke in the night shouting orders to men long dead, reliving in dreams the battle on the ridge, where she had proven that courage and leadership know no gender, that one determined person can alter the course of history. Her legacy endures in the military doctrines that study her operations, in the special forces that trace their lineage to the SOE she served, in the women who have followed her into combat roles once reserved for men. But perhaps her true monument lies in the memory of that firefight in the Auvergne, when Nancy Wake, armed with a Sten gun and absolute conviction, led her outnumbered fighters against an army and won, not through superior force, but through the willingness to risk everything, to be present in the moment of crisis, to transform moral commitment into physical action. She never claimed to be a hero, always insisting that she had simply done what needed to be done in circumstances that demanded everything she had to give. But in that self-effacing honesty lies the essence of genuine heroism, the quality that distinguishes those who act from those who merely observe, that separates the participants in history from its victims. Nancy Wake parachuted into occupied France, organized an army in the shadows, fought the Germans at close quarters, and survived to tell the tale. Not because she was superhuman, but because she refused to accept that one person cannot make a difference, that the forces of oppression are invincible, that the right moment to resist never comes. Her war ended in 1945, but her example remains, challenging each generation to find its own courage, to stand when standing is required, to lead when leadership can save lives. The White Mouse who evaded the Gestapo, the commander who defeated a German battalion, the woman who buried her grief in action and emerged from the fire transformed, speaks to us still across the decades, her voice clear and uncompromising. When freedom is threatened, when evil advances, when ordinary people are called to extraordinary duty, there is no substitute for courage, no excuse for inaction, no limit to what determined individuals can achieve together.